As I mentioned previously, data has really become ubiquitous, and one consequence of that is a lot of people are really feeling overwhelmed by the amount of data available to them, and they don't even know where to start. So what I want to do with this flowchart is suggest ways that you can think about matching the question you have to different data collection methods so that you do know where to start. And our starting point will be at whether our question is a why or an exploratory question. So the idea behind a why question is kind of self-explanatory. It usually starts with the word why. So for instance, why are people who used to buy from us no longer doing so? Why are this group of stakeholders dissatisfied with us? Why are our sales down? Exploratory questions are kind of similar, but in those instances, we might not even have enough information to frame the request yet. So it might even be something like, what do our stakeholders even think about us at all? Maybe we don't know that their opinion of us has changed. We just don't know what they think in the first place. We might be looking at factors that drive a certain phenomena without knowing at all what factors those are. So those would be examples of exploratory questions. If we've got an exploratory question or a why question, it's usually a pretty good indication that we're going to be going down a qualitative path because qualitative techniques tend to be very well suited to why and exploratory type questions. If we are going down that path, then the next question that we need to ask ourselves, having established that we have a why or an exploratory question, is this a topic that people tend to talk about in social media? So for instance, if we think about something related to politics or a big event in culture or in sports or something like that, people are probably talking about it in social media. And if that's the case, then something like scraped tweets is probably going to be our first starting point in getting answers to our question because that information will be out there in the public domain. It's relatively easy and accessible to get, so it's a good starting point for investigating our question. A theme that will come up throughout our discussion of this flowchart is even if we go and get the scraped tweets, it might not answer every last question and every part of the question that we have, but it will be a really good starting point, and we might still have some questions remaining that we have to then go through this process again to find out what sort of method we should be using for getting the data, but it's a very good starting point. If we have a topic that is a why or an exploratory question, but it's not one that people talk a lot about in social media, then the next thing to consider is it a topic that people talk to other people about? So examples where something isn't talked about in social media but is talked about with others might be kind of local issues. What's going on in your neighborhood, in your community, in your school, in your workplace. Those are all things that you might be talking to other people in those same communities of interest about, but you wouldn't be talking about in social media because a lot of the people who you interact with on social media just don't know what's going on with the local school or community issue or something like that and just don't care so much about it. If that's the type of issue, one where people are not talking about it in social media, but they are talking about it with others, then focus groups are probably our way to go. With a focus group, what we're doing is getting a small group of people together and getting them to talk about that issue. And that discussion sort of emulates what would happen naturally. People are reacting to one another, they're agreeing, they're disagreeing, they're building on each other's ideas. So focus groups work really well for that type of question and that type of topic. Examples of topics where people tend not to talk about them with others would be things like questions about finances or health issues, potentially embarrassing behaviors like overconsumption of alcohol or drugs or something like that. For those sorts of topics, interviews tend to be better. Many people would be reluctant to participate at all if you were asking them those kinds of questions in a large group. They might temper their answers and not give you full and truthful information in a group setting, whereas they would do that in an interview setting. So in that situation, interviews work well. So that's the qualitative side of things. If our question is not a why question or an exploratory question, it's more likely to be something like a who, what, where type question, then we're most likely down a quantitative path. So in that instance, we first want to ask ourselves whether our question is behaviorally based. What I mean by behaviorally based is things like, can we actually see or would it be possible to see what you're doing? So maybe you're making a purchase or you're not. You are taking something from your online shopping cart and you are making it a purchase, or you're abandoning your cart. You're clicking on something on a website, or you're not clicking on it, or you're moving away from that website. Those are all behaviorally based questions, and that we can see them. We can contrast a behaviorally based question with an attitudinal question where we can't externally observe what the answer is because it's really inside your head. So, how do you feel about this particular brand? How do you feel about this particular politician? Those are more attitudinal or sometimes preference based questions. But if we do have a behaviorally based question, then the next thing that we need to consider is relevant passively collected data available? Because if it is, that's often going to be our best bet for answering the question. The fact that it's behaviorally based means that it's possible for there to be passively collected data available. And if it is, that data usually tends to be very accurate because it's being collected by sensors or other pretty objective instruments. And so we can trust the data. It's also easily available if it already exists in some cases. So if we're just looking at something like web analytics, that data is really easy to get. So we would want to go with that option. If relevant passively collected data isn't available, or if what we have is not a behaviorally based question, but an attitudinally based question, then the next thing that we need to consider is relevant third-party or registration data available? So this gets back to maybe it's been an outside organization, the likes of Nielsen or something has already done a survey about this particular topic. Maybe a government census organization has already done a survey about this particular topic. If that's the case, then we would again want to use their data, even if it means that we subsequently might have to get our own data on the very specific things that are not already answered by the third-party data. But if that data is already available, we would want to use that first, because if it's not available, then what we have to do is do a survey or an experiment, and those can be time-consuming and expensive. They also put a burden on the respondents, so we'd rather rule out the other sources of information first and only do that for the things that we can't get information about in any other way.